And just as you get spectrums of team culture in national culture, for example, you get the same in organizational and team culture. And you can see, again, the difference in visuals that we can use to understand the sorts of cultures that sit behind the images. These are two recent photographs when when the government shutdown was about to kick off in the United States, and Nancy Pelosi was being sworn in as the Speaker of the House, and she chose to take her oath in front of any children that were present in the audience to make a visual representation of her attitude towards inclusivity, sustainability, and thinking towards the future. At the very same time, Donald Trump was making an announcement in the press room of the White House about his ambitions to build his wall between the United States and Mexico. And he appeared in front of 5 white, bald men who all looked quite mean and scary. And these were members of the US border force. And the visual representation of the different types of culture that sit behind these two powerful individuals is fascinating to see. And you get a dichotomy in organizational culture between what we describe as control culture and commitment culture. In control culture, you often see a deep hierarchy. There's a tightly controlling authority voice from the top of the hierarchy, and that makes it difficult to operate effectively within teams because teams do not get the opportunity to form a sense of shared higher order goals because all of their operating objectives are dictated to them from above. Compare that to commitment culture, which has typically a reduced level of hierarchy, and they focus on quality. And this is one of the obvious distinctions that you can see between a controlling culture and a commitment culture within a team. A control culture focuses on quantitative measurements. Now, we mentioned previously the idea of proxy measures and different forms of performance measurement. A controlling culture will focus solely on these sorts of measurable criteria because they are black and white and they are a means of further controlling the people within the team. Something as simple as signing in and out of work is an example of a means of control. That doesn't mean it's necessarily negative, but presenteeism is another typical symptom of highly controlling environments where employees, team members are expected to be present, and that's the thing that's important as opposed to productive. Compared to commitment cultures which have a focus on quality. So there's a qualitative assessment of the value of the team. So they are outcome driven, and rather than working out how much time you spent with your bum on your seat working, they look at whatever manner in which you produced the work that you produced, what was the quality of the outcome. And that's a very empowering approach to creating a team culture. There is always evidence of open communication and participation. That being said, these organizations are harder to create. These teams are harder to create, the type of commitment culture teams. They require a lot more upfront investment. So the paradox, and we've come across several paradoxes in our discussions today. One of the paradoxes here is that it's the barriers to entry for creating a commitment culture within a team are much higher, so it's harder to do it. The barriers to entry for a control culture are certainly lower, and therefore that tends to be why when organizations are tight on resources, tight on time, they tend to revert to a control form of culture because it's easier to implement and it's easier to demonstrate output. The irony comes when the organization has to inevitably go through change, and all organizations and all teams within organizations must go through change at some point. That's going to happen simply as a result of a changing environment, whether direct issues within their own working environment change, the broader macro environment will always be changing. The irony is that commitment culture teams embrace and deal with change a lot more easily and at a lot lower cost than control culture organizations and teams. So the payback, if you like, for investing up front in developing a commitment culture team comes over the long run. And you can see that playing out in successful organizations, successful teams, successful businesses as they grow and develop over time. Those that have made a concerted effort to invest in a commitment culture reap the rewards as they develop. And you will always find that team culture exists on a range of different continua. For example, the ideas of power and status that we've just discussed in the previous slide also relate to a dimension of culture in teams, and that is the power dimension. If there's a sense of high power distance, that is that a lot of authority lies at the top and then there is a deep hierarchy beneath that authority. That creates a status orientated team, so people are naturally put into competition with one another because they are told and they are signaled by the environment to value the status that they gain as they develop their position within the team. It also can lead to reduced creativity because people expect to be told what to do, and they're become used to that idea that authority dictates from above what they're doing. And that also results in lower engagement and participation because a significant factor in participation and commitment is whether motivation to contribute to the team's goals comes from within. If it's an intrinsic motivation, if you're intrinsically motivated, then your levels of commitment will increase and your levels of participation will increase. In high power cultures, one of the consequences is lower participation. In a low power, at the other end of the spectrum, in a low power environment, is more egalitarian in terms of its hierarchical depth. So there isn't such a sense of there's a big boss and the big boss dictates down the way in the chain. And there's therefore less of a concern about relative status among actors because people have a sense of being empowered and therefore their identities within the team are they're stronger and they're more internally derived as opposed to being externally ascribed by, for example, job titles. The difficulty, however, with low power team cultures is they're difficult to manage because of that autonomy. There tend to be more conflicts because people feel as though they do have a voice and therefore they can use it, and very often those voices are conflicting, and the result is that there are many more disagreements. There can be implementation problems with new agendas, for example, because the willingness to take on board different opinions and the distribution of power and authority across the team means that getting a decision over the line and through is more challenging. And I can speak from experience on this because a university is a classic example of a low power distance organization, and particularly within departments there is a great deal of distributed authority and power and a great deal of autonomy among academics, and a university is a good environment in which to explore that kind of team culture. Another example is the attitude towards risk. These relate almost directly to national culture characteristics that you may have come across before. So you have risk avoidance cultures where within the team they value harmony and stability and look for normative behavior and establishing rules in order to ensure that they retain that cohesion and goodwill and well-being among the team members. And then you get risk-taking cultures who value the concept of change, are much more biased towards taking action, and they consider conflict as something that is positive for the development of the team. So they're almost trying to agitate, trying to aggravate the members of the team in order to get to a conclusion. That can be a high stress environment as well, and there are particular examples of working cultures that are quintessentially risk-taking cultures, and the financial sector is a classic one. You will see many examples of risk-taking teams that operate within the financial sector. Finally, it's worth mentioning transnational teams because in today's business world, transnational teams are such a common element of work and how we do work. The issue with transnational teams is that you are immediately including not just the team cultural dynamics, but also the national and social cultural dynamics of the members of the team. Brought into the mix the fact that they may not even be working directly together. They may be working via digital media, for example. So you've got immediately cultural distance to worry about in terms of people's approach to collectivism or individualism. You've got people's attitudes towards status or power distance. And I can remember an anecdote I was told by someone who worked in the oil industry in Norway, where there is a very low power distance traditionally in Scandinavian countries, and this oil company had recently been bought over by an oil business in Texas, and the big boss flew over from Texas and was implementing some form of change into a department, and he told the Norwegian employee that this is what was going to happen and he'd like him to do it. And the Norwegian employee turned around to him and said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And that was something that was perfectly acceptable for him to do in his low power distance, much more collectivist culture. And suddenly he was working in a team where someone was expecting an individualist high power distance response, and he didn't get it, and it caused a great deal of conflict. We've got cultural identity into the mix as well. Nature of communication. We are in a British university, and the Brits are famous for indirect communication. We won't tell you something's rubbish, we'll tell you that's interesting. We won't tell you that you're crazy with your ideas, we'll say that's quite an ambitious idea. And then you have typically Central European countries are classically more direct in the way they communicate. The stereotype is direct German communication, but certainly France, any other Central European countries, Italy, are cultures where people are well known for speaking rather directly and openly about their thoughts and feelings. The way in which status is privileged and understood. Familiarity and adoption of communication technology can also cause problems, and nature of reward systems across different national boundaries and contexts and different teams. So the nature by which a team is rewarded will be contingent on the team's culture, and this the value of the reward for a team will be interpreted differently depending on the nature of the team and the nature of the national cultures that make up the team. So creating effective transnational teams, and this applies to normal teams as well, it's investment at the start once again. There's a reason why your second piece of coursework is intended to look at induction. The start is fundamentally important. I'm involved in some research at the moment. It's called action research, which is where we are acting almost as consultants as researchers and giving the organization ideas and things to try out to improve their practice. And one of the things that we are focusing on is induction, is bringing teams together at the start. There's too much of a fast track to getting on with the job and not enough time invested in forming a cohesive team at the start. So spending more time initially to onboard the team is very important, particularly with transnational teams. There needs to be an encouragement of a common perspective and cultural awareness, and that is compounded when you're not actually physically together, because stereotypes and defensive routines, as Kahneman and Tversky would call them, they kind of kick in to automatic pilot and cause a lot of difficulty. Strong leadership is required, and an ability for the culture to shift depending on where the momentum is at any one time, i.e. if you've got a team working between Japan and America, a hybrid team, and the momentum of tasks moves between the two countries depending on what's going on at the time, there needs to be the ability for the culture to slightly shift towards the dominant team culture at that time. Now, team culture can have a deadly effect, and it can have a life-saving effect as well. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 1980s, Korean Air kept having accidents. Its aircraft full of passengers kept crashing. And one of the things that they realized after they did some research, they actually brought a air crash investigation specialist into Korean Air because they needed to understand why their planes kept crashing, much more so than anyone else's planes. And the reason the consultant established was team culture, cockpit culture, as he would call it. The problem was there was too much power with the captain, too much respect, too much power distance with the captain. And the co-pilot, who was second in command of the aircraft and was an equally trained pilot, didn't have enough voice in the cockpit, so that when the aircraft encountered difficulties, encountered challenges, the co-pilot didn't feel empowered enough to be able to suggest to the captain that something was done. And there's a classic example where a Korean Airways, I think it was a 747, so a big passenger aircraft, was flying over water and on its way into the land, and was approaching a mountain range. And it was essentially the captain had put in the altitude setting wrong, so the plane had started to descend, and the co-pilot said, Captain, there seems to be a bit of an issue with altitude here. I think we're going to be flying a bit close to the mountains. And the captain said, no, it's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. And the co-pilot, who was still looking at the altitude, knowing it was wrong, politely again said, Captain, I do think that we should possibly have a look at the altitude. And the captain dismissed him again. Ground warning light alarm started to go off. The captain still ignored him. And it's almost comical, even though it's terrible. Essentially, the last thing that the co-pilot said before the plane crashed into a mountain was, "Oh, Captain, that mountain looks quite close, doesn't it?" And then it was too late by that point. And this was simply team culture having a fatal impact on the consequences for this team. A more positive example of how organizational and team culture can have really positive impact is with an American oil company. And this company got a new CEO. I say oil, I should say metal company, beg your pardon. And this company got a new CEO. It's called Paul O'Neill, and he came in and he had his first shareholders meeting. So he's addressing the people who own the business, and setting out his manifesto for what he plans to do as CEO. And he said the only thing that he planned to focus on was health and safety. I only want to talk to you about workplace safety, was what he said to these shareholders. And this was because he'd seen that a lot of workers were being injured or even dying every year in workplace accidents, and he wanted to reduce that because they're working with hot metals and so on. And this is a group of investors who are looking for a return on their investment, and they were kind of flabbergasted. They were saying, "Oh, what are you talking about? Why are you telling us about worker safety? We want to know about profit." And his response to that was, "I don't think you heard me. I only care about worker safety." And there was actually a move made by shareholders calling him a crazy hippie CEO. There was a move made by them to try and get him sacked before he'd even started, but he managed to resist that, and he turned the company's safety record but also their profits around. So workplace culture can indirectly have a very positive effect for the bottom line as well. So every year 1.86 workdays were lost to injury for every 100 workers when he took over. By 2012, that's 20 years later, by 2012, the rate for the company had fallen to 0.125 days. But what's even more amazing is that their profits skyrocketed as a result as well. So it was like an indirect fostering of a different kind of culture, which ultimately led to high increased profits. So there is a holy grail out there for the way in which an inclusive and caring team culture can lead to profitability.